Hi, my name is Katie Wright. I have vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or VEDS, and I run a podcast called Staying Connected, where I talk to people about their stories with VEDS and similar conditions. Today's presentation is on emergency preparedness while living with a rare condition. And while I come at this from an angle of having vascular EDS, I think that it's really important to apply to any medical condition that you might have. So like I said, I have vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. VEDS is associated with a lot of life-threatening emergencies, unfortunately, including arterial and aortic dissections and ruptures, hollow organ ruptures like the bowels and the uterus if someone is pregnant, and lung collapse, as well as some other things like carotid cavernous sinus fistula. And I was diagnosed with VEDS in 2017, May of 2017. I got my genetic confirmation. And I went through a lot of emergency preparedness stuff when I was diagnosed, and I thought I had a good plan. But later that year in December of 2017, I had a transient ischemic attack, otherwise known as a mini stroke. And this happened about 2:30 in the morning. I lived alone. I had gotten up to get a glass of water, and on my way back to bed, I collapsed. I realized very quickly I was having what I thought was a stroke, partial inability to use one side of my body. The room was spinning. It was very hard to see. It was a mess. I couldn't get to my phone easily. It was about 15 or 20 feet away on my nightstand, and I had to crawl to it. I couldn't dial 911. I didn't know any shortcuts on my phone. And actually, I was doing immersion learning, first learning Swedish at that time. And so my phone was in Swedish. And I was trying to hit the buttons on the phone to dial 911, but I kept hitting 941. I also accidentally messaged a coworker, and I had to try really hard to call 911. I had an extra key to the apartment. My neighbor had it, and I told the emergency responders that on the phone, but they didn't go and get that from her, I don't think. I think they went right to my door, and so I ended up crawling to the door to let them in. And when they got there, I had this emergency booklet all about VEDS and my medical history that I was given when I got my diagnosis, but I had to tell the emergency responders where it was. So I started rethinking my plan after this. I started rethinking all of the what ifs. Usually what ifs can be very, very anxiety producing, but I think it's really important to think about these when we're talking about emergency preparedness. So what if I had been unable to speak? Right? What if I couldn't reach the phone? What if I couldn't tell them I had VEDS? What if, just so many different what ifs was going, my phone was dead. What if my phone was dead? There's all of these things. And I started thinking about those and then trying to find solutions to those possibilities. My initial solutions were to first I tried to apply for what's known as a premise file in some locations. And other places, it might be called something else, but it's essentially a note in the local, in the first responder database for your local area. And the way it's been explained to me is that when someone calls 911 from an address that has a premise file attached to it, it'll pop up with a note, this person prone to aortic dissection or whatever it is. So I tried to apply for one of those. Unfortunately, I was denied because the medical examiner thought that vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome was common enough and that the first responders should all know what it is, which we all probably know here is not true. So then my next solution was a door sign. And my first iteration of the door sign is here on this slide. It says, "Attention emergency personnel. Caitlin has vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, also known as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome type 4, high likelihood of artery ruptures, artery dissections, and organ ruptures." So in my passion for or being upset about not having a premise file, I ended up putting this on the door, which did actually help me in my next emergency when the first responders had to come again. I got a key box and I gave the first responders, like the fire station locally, the code to the key box. They never really had to use that, luckily, but I was just thinking, what if I couldn't get the key? And I didn't want them to have to bust down the door. I thought about fall detection devices. I ended up with an Apple Watch, which does have some fall detection capabilities. And it was the first reason why I actually got one of those. I made sure to get an emergency bracelet. I was wearing a necklace at the time, and the first responders told me at that time in 2017, like, you should probably have a bracelet. And I hated wearing things on my wrist, but I got one. I developed a phone tree so I didn't have to contact every single person that was close to me and let them know what happened. I basically like had three primary people, or like one primary person that would notify three people, and then those three people were responsible for notifying the larger group that they were a part of. And of course, I got the okay for those people to be on that phone tree, but that made it so that I didn't have to share updates with every single person. It just happened for me. I started really getting into first responder education at that time. I started visiting fire stations and meeting the first responders every time I moved, and they were always really appreciative about for that. So I really highly recommend doing that for where you live. Helps not to be a mystery when you have somebody responding to your address. And then shortcuts on my phone, I didn't realize existed. In case you don't know, if you have an iPhone, you can hit the button on the side a few times, and that will call 911. So that whole time I was struggling to call 911 by pressing the buttons. Really, all I had to do was hit the side button, and I had no idea. So learn the shortcuts on your phone, on your watch. There's shortcuts on the watch. There's shortcuts, I think, on all sorts of things. And think about those. So those are my initial solutions. And then in 2021, I had a couple emergencies in between 2017 and 2021. I had several mini strokes between 2017 and 2018. But I think that the spleen rupture in 2021 really highlights how things went right. So I was living in a camper at the time. I had just moved to Seattle, Washington to be closer to my care team, ironically. Maybe I had been there for like a month. And I was outside getting a soda from the fridge outside when I suddenly had pain and knew I was internally bleeding. If you've had one of these, it's a lot of times like emergencies, you can tell that something is really, really wrong, and I could tell. So I called 911 immediately. I used the shortcut on my phone, I think. I told them I had VEDS. I told them I thought I was internally bleeding, and I told them I needed an ambulance. They asked me, why do you think that you're internally bleeding? I said, well, I have a condition that causes organ and artery ruptures. I need an ambulance, and they got one. I then called my vascular surgeon, who I had contact information for, and she alerted the hospital and then stayed on the phone with me. So when the first responders arrived, she was there on the phone while they were taking my vitals and getting me into the ambulance to let them know, hey, she needs to go to this hospital. And this is, what we think is going on. It's really important that she gets there. I don't know everything she said, but I do know that she directed them to the right hospital, and she already had a resident waiting for me when I arrived. So resident, seriously, he was outside in the hallway when I got there. And he really advocated for me to get that CTA. Over and over again, has she had the CTA yet? She really needs a CTA. We think she's internally bleeding. So I did have the CTA, and I had internal bleeding. We found out my spleen ruptured, and I was admitted. The picture on the screen is several days into my hospital stay for my spleen rupture. And it was the first time I was able to sit up in bed since I was admitted. It was a really, really big deal. I lost more than half of my blood volume, and it was a really scary experience. But I love sharing this picture because it makes me happy to see the recovery process, and I survived. So some takeaways and resources that I want you to have as you think about your own emergency plan. Think about the basics. One of the major things that I did was establish a care team and I learned how to use it. Early on, I was afraid to contact my vascular surgeon for things because I had always been, you know, doctors don't want you to call them, doctors don't want to know. But then I was diagnosed with this rare condition, and I was given a cell phone number by my vascular surgeon, and I was still afraid to use it. Use it if you need it. Find a way to get a doctor on your care team that is familiar with your condition or willing to be familiar with your condition and is able to help in emergencies. A lot of doctors actually have an on-call phone line that's monitored by someone. And so just talk to your doctor about your emergency plan and what you would do in an emergency or what you would do for your child if they're having an emergency, or your spouse or loved one or whoever it is. Find solutions to those what ifs. If there's a lot of what ifs that keep popping up in your brain, do something about them. Do what you can about them, and then let go. Try really hard to let go of the ones that you can't. I can't solve every what if, and I know that with VEDS, and preparing for emergencies that might happen really helped me let go of the what ifs that I couldn't control. Prepare for emergencies, get a bag together if you want. I don't do that, but I know a lot of people who do. Just be thoughtful about what could happen and prepare for those so that you can get it out of your mind. I highly recommend talking to first responders. They're usually very, very happy to know that that you have whatever condition that you have, and that they get the opportunity to be educated about it. Being at the time 28 years old when I had my first TIA, or my first big TIA that they had to respond to, if they didn't know that I had this condition, if I wasn't able to talk or anything like that, they might have assumed that I had a low blood sugar episode or something because I look healthy on the outside. Keep your emergency information on hand, whatever that looks like for you. If you're a folder carrying person, carry a folder, but I'm not. I keep information in my phone. I've got a medical ID. I've got a little wallet card, and I rely on those things a lot. And then this is a really, really important one. Know the signs of an emergency associated with your condition. If you have VEDS, you should know that arteries and organs can rupture, and the aorta can dissect, and lungs can collapse. If there are specific emergencies associated with the rare condition that you have, know what the signs of those are. I did ignore one time the signs of an emergency, and I did not realize that I was having a small arterial bleed. And looking back on it, the signs were really obvious once I learned what they were. So it's scary to look at, but know those signs. And that way you can more easily decipher whether what you're experiencing is an emergency. And then, have a doctor on your care team that if you don't know, you can call them or text them or however they prefer to be contacted. I want to close, I'd like to give you some emergency preparedness resources like the emergency preparedness kit and wallet cards and medical or bracelets. Your care team, I think, is something that you need to develop on your own, but there are resources out there to help you do that through the VEDS movement. There's some webinars there. So here's some examples of the emergency kits and wallet cards. There's one from the VEDS movement that's specific for VEDS, and it was designed by the VEDS movement in partnership with the VEDS Collaborative, and I keep this in my wallet. The Ehlers-Danlos Society has one as well for all forms of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And on this slide, I've put a couple QR codes that will go directly to those, whichever one that you need. And I'm going to leave this up for a second so that you have time to scan the QR code. If this QR codes for some reason don't work, if you're watching this 5 years from now and those QR codes don't work, the links are on the bottom, and hopefully those still work. And I also wanted to include this. The Marfan Foundation came up with a patient care coordination note for EPIC. This is something that your doctor would put into your, it's specific for EPIC, but whatever your electronic health record program that your doctor uses, your doctor should be able to put one of these in. And this one is specific for VEDS, Loeys-Dietz, and Marfan syndrome, but And I'm not sure if the Ehlers-Danlos Society has one for Ehlers-Danlos, but I wanted to put this up here. If you don't have VEDS or Loeys Dietz or Marfan, this could be a good template to use for developing one for the condition that you have. And I think it's really important. Basically, like if you have one of these notes and let's say your doctor uses Epic or MyChart and you go to a hospital that uses Epic or MyChart within the same network of facilities that your doctor uses, then they should be able to see this note while you're going through triage. There's also a free medical ID for people with genetically confirmed vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome through the VEDS movement. So I'm going to leave that up here. I know that the Marfan Foundation also has a discount code with Sticky J. I'm not sure what the code is, but you can find it on their website. And then if the Ehlers-Danlos Society has a specific code, hopefully they'll put it in the description of this webinar. But if not, I would ask them. But important to have a medical ID. Very, very important. So thank you for your attention. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my experiences with you. And I hope that this helps you develop your own emergency preparedness plan.